All right, so what is Napoleon doing during the French Revolution? He's a very important general in the French Revolution. That's how he becomes famous. So if it wasn't for the French Revolution, probably wouldn't have heard of him. This is Napoleon's empire at its height, 1812. Napoleon has done some quite astounding things. He did a lot more than Louis XIV in terms of conquering others. Notice that French satellites and French allies, huge amount of the continent. The only people that are enemies, Portugal, England, and their great naval power, Great Britain rather, Sardinia, Sicily, and Russia, and Kingdom of Sweden. So Napoleon has accomplished quite a bit at the peak of his reign, more so than really anyone else. And the question is, how did the French Revolution make Napoleon possible? And we're just going to be talking about that today. And I'll go through, the general chronology of Napoleon. How did the French Revolution make Napoleon possible? Let's start at the beginning. Napoleon's born in Corsica. Corsica is not France. He becomes the emperor of France. He's not French. Napoleon is more Italian than French. Corsica speaks a dialect of Northern Italian. Napoleon was born into minor nobility on Corsica. And during the reign of Louis XVI and previous, France had already been expanding and been experiencing great wealth. Of course, we know this from Louis XIV and the Atlantic trade economy. So France is really kind of a bully on the block even before Napoleon, And Corsica is one of those locations that is defeated by the French. Napoleon is his nobility from Corsica. He resents the French. He hates the French because they conquered his island of Corsica. He resented his father for taking a position at Versailles and serving under the French king, Louis XVI. Napoleon resented that. But Napoleon becomes the leader of France. How ironic. So that is Napoleon's attitude on the French. He hates them. He hates the aristocratic privileges. He hates what they've done to him and his people. But his father gains a great position at Versailles. And because his father wins so much support, he's able to send Napoleon to basically military college. French is his second language, so his accent is pretty thick. And he speaks what sounds like more like a southern French dialect or northern Italian dialect, somewhere there in his language. And so as he was going through officer training, the French officers would make fun of him. These are aristocratic officers, of course. And Napoleon was pretty much alone through officer training. His resentment built even more after he met some of these aristocratic peers, And so as he's highly ambitious. And when the French Revolution comes around, he sees his opportunity. He's actually on Corsica when the French Revolution happens. And his relatives and friends want him to stop going on and on about the opportunity that he wants to go to Paris and become a general for the French Revolutionary government. Because remember, at this time, nobody knows who's going to win. Everyone's paranoid. They don't know whose side to take. Do you take the side of the revolution, or do you take the side of all the aristocracy on Europe? And so very early on, Napoleon saw the opportunity in the French Revolution. And so since he was already an officer, he became a very important general during the French Revolution. There were newspapers at the time. And he became very popular, very famous for his efforts for the French Revolution. A lot of people say he was very lucky. There are many times when all the other officers around him were shot and killed off their horse, and he remained. So Napoleon has a strange amount of luck as well. And it's the French Revolution where he changes his attitude. He feels like the aristocracy in France, he feels like the wrongs done to him in Corsica have been vindicated because of the guillotine, because of the Reign of Terror, because of everything that's going on with the revolution. We're chopping aristocratic heads off. So he likes that. He feels vindicated. He's okay now with being a hero to the French, right? So it's the French Revolution that not only gave him the ability to become a great popular general, it also allowed him to change his attitude and become that general. And instead of resenting the French, he becomes the leader of the French. Okay, so two things there to help you answer that question. His ascent. As Napoleon becomes famous during the French Revolution, he becomes sort of like one of the head generals of the interior. And he pulls off some great military feats. He goes into Italy and captures and defeats Italian forces for the French. and he sends back stolen artwork. So great works from the Renaissance and from the Romans, he takes and sends to Paris. And so many of those stolen works are still in Paris in the Louvre. And so you can see those stolen works today. Because he's fighting for the French Revolution against the counter-revolution, he's so successful, he's a hero. He's already a hero during the French Revolution. After Italy, Napoleon decides to go into Egypt. This is a huge PR campaign. He's doing it for the publicity, to show his power, to build more fame, because maybe he has his eyes on a bigger prize, and he gets that prize. So what happens when he goes into Egypt, remember the Brits rule the seas, and it was Lord Admiral Nelson and his fleet who, once Napoleon got across, he basically prevented Napoleon from getting back to France. Also prevented supplies from going to France to Egypt. So Napoleon goes into Egypt, and initially it's a horrible failure. It's humiliating that Lord Admiral Nelson, this Brit, would do this to Napoleon so effortlessly. And it seemed like such a blunder for Napoleon. But Napoleon, this isn't going to, a great leader, someone who has power, is accustomed to having power and has been playing the game for a while. The art of spin is extremely valuable. Negative publicity doesn't have to be negative publicity if you can spin it the right way. So Napoleon spins this horrible situation and creates a war against the Ottoman Mamluks, Turks, and defeats them easily. He brings scientists and archaeologists to Egypt, and they begin making certain discoveries. They discover a new variety of plant, and they discover the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is a large black stone. It has Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Rosetta Stone gives us the ability to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs. So ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs can be translated now because of Napoleon. So you have Greek writing on one side and you have Egyptian hieroglyphs on the other side. And they say the same things, they're the same words. Because in an empire, at the time that the Greek and Egyptian was written, probably the Ptolemaic era, the Hellenistic era, people would write different languages that say the same thing on the same object, so everyone could read it. So if there's a Greek, they can read the same law or whatever as someone who reads the Egyptian hieroglyphic text can read that same thing, right? So it's in multiple languages. The Rosetta Stone is written in multiple languages, and so now, because we already know Greek, we can translate to Greek and then translate the Egyptian, and now we can translate Egyptian. So this is because of Napoleon. Now remember all this, the Rosetta Stone and his defeat of the Mamluk Turks and all this great propaganda and press releases that are sent back to France are all covering up the idea that he was defeated. Not defeated, but the Admiral got one up on him. Yeah, Napoleon was stuck in Egypt for actually a while. But Napoleon, sent back articles and talked about different discoveries and different battles that he was having at the time. So it's the art of spin. He was able to create a counter-propaganda, even though he essentially was on the losing end of that skirmish. So out of that great fame, that failure, but great fame in Egypt, Napoleon comes back and takes over the government with a coup. It's a little bit sloppy coup if you read about it. It's not quite working out very well. It's actually Napoleon's brother who steps in and makes things go the way they should. But Napoleon basically becomes the leader of France, and then a number of years later, remember this is kind of a coup, it's illegal, but he has really popular support, he decides to become emperor of France. And because he has so much popular support, they set up a scenario where he's voted in as the emperor of France. So what started as a coup became something somewhat legitimate. He becomes French emperor. The Continental system, it's an agreement that he makes with Austria and Russia. And remember, England is the big naval power. They also have the greatest ability to trade with other places. And so Napoleon is really threatened by England, and he wants to damage them economically. So with the Continental system, other continental European places are forbidden to trade with England. And so he's sort of unifying the continent. Well, there would eventually be a skirmish against Moscow, against Russia, because they had secretly been trading with England the whole time, and essentially it's a revolt. Napoleon goes into Moscow in 1812. It's one of his great failures. This is not the first time this has happened, but what the Russians do when a great force invades Moscow is they burn their city and leave. They make sure there's no food. In Moscow, it's difficult to get to Moscow. You got to go through a lot of snow and these border militant tribes like Cossacks. And so what happened after the great failure, the burning of Moscow, Napoleon turns back and is harangued by Cossack warriors all the way out of Russia. It's through Poland, through they have to go through Germany and then France. So it was a great failure. It was sort of the beginning of the weakening of Napoleon. Many of his great officers died. But at his ascent, he became emperor. This is an image when Napoleon had already crowned himself. The Pope is somewhere in here. I assume it's the seated guy, but the ostentatious hats make me question things. Like, hey, that guy's hat is a lot better. Maybe he's the Pope. So Napoleon, even though he's going to be crowned emperor by the Pope, he takes the crown from the Pope and crowns himself. And then he crowns Josephine, I'm pretty sure it's his wife at the time. And this, of course, is his beloved mother. He was very obsessed with his mother and resentful against his father. But a coalition of forces led, generally by the English, especially the last skirmish, led to the downfall and defeat of Napoleon. Napoleon had to be defeated numerous times before they got rid of him. So a great leader, they can lose battles. That doesn't really make a difference, right? You can lose and be the greatest leader of all time. But Napoleon, it took him, had to be defeated, 2 great defeats, and he was actually exiled twice onto 2 different islands. The first time he was exiled, it was an island close to Italy called Elba, and he managed to escape. And his French officers were extremely loyal to him. So he basically escaped his first exile on the island. And next thing you know, the French generals were fighting for him again. So he was a great force. He was popular. He inspired wild devotion that he could just leave his island and take most of the officers of France, and they just turn coat and go under him. It's the Duke of Wellington, English Duke of Wellington, who is celebrated for defeating Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. The Duke of Wellington is such a celebrated hero in England that the residents of the Duke in Wellington in London, they made his address 1. So if you want to send a letter to the Duke of Wellington, you write on the envelope 1, London. Put it in the mailbox. So this is a picture. It's a museum today, the Apsley House in London, and its address is 1, because the Duke of Wellington was such a hero. The Duke of Wellington, there's a statue of Duke of Wellington on a horse in front, but for the longest time, the Duke of Wellington was known to have a statue of Napoleon in front of his house. So after the Duke of Wellington defeated Napoleon, he stole one of his most popular statues and put it in front of his own house. A point of pride for the Duke of Wellington. Okay, so here we are. How did the French Revolution make Napoleon possible? An attitude change with the French Revolution, right? Remember, he hated the French at first. He becomes a French Revolution general. He gains popular appeal. And the universal draft, the French Revolution is the first time that the universal draft was instituted. So in other words, all males within a certain age group, no matter the class, you can draft them into the military now. This is possible only with the French Revolution. Why? Because the general population of France not only had a great sense of pride, revolutionary pride, they also had a great sense of counter-revolution fear. So the universal draft was instituted at a time when people were more likely to agree with the idea of joining the military because they were under a real threat. But it's this universal draft that continues whether you're under threat or not, and that is now instituted. And Napoleon institutes this draft, and he's able to create the greatest military in Europe. Why? Because you can fill more bodies. You just bring in all eligible males into the military, have them serve a term. Napoleon inspired great loyalty. He brought in new generals. Napoleon had a system of meritocracy in the military. Meritocracy means you move up through the ranks based on your merit, not your aristocratic class or who your parents are. This inspired great loyalty as well, because you could create great generals who knew that Napoleon was solely responsible for their position. Because they're not aristocrats, they were just favored by Napoleon. Napoleon gave them a great position. So all their loyalty goes to Napoleon. What the French Revolution has to do with that is that, well, the French Revolution got rid of aristocratic generals, unless they became, unless they renounced their aristocratic ties. So you have to have some new generals in there. And then he absorbed ideals of the French Revolution. He is known for saying, I am the revolution. He gives people the impression that he's continuing the revolution, not stopping it. In reality, Napoleon just became another emperor, dictator. He might as well have been a Bourbon aristocrat for some of the things that he did against the people's will. He did many good things as well, and we'll talk about that Wednesday, but he claimed to be the revolution, but not 100% true, of course. A lot of that is propaganda.